Thank you so much, Sheila. And thank you, Ms. Miller. Again, we are so honored to have author Donna Marie Miller with us this evening. Let me really quick, we're going to start with her, we're going to start with a PowerPoint slide so that she can tell us all about her book and give us her presentation. Hold on one moment. And here we are. Does everybody who is able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes, the PowerPoint is on the screen.
All right. All right. Well, I'll let you take it away, Ms. Miller, if you'd like to start.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight at the talk at the Texas Book Talk at Texas State. I'm really honored to be part of that program because The Broken Spoke was gifted quite a wonderful sum to be published back in 2017. And usually whenever I have a book talk, I always start by playing music that James White wrote and sang as part of the Broken Spoke. But since we're going to have the slideshow, I'll just go ahead and play that while we talk. But he would always start with the Broken Spoke song that he wrote, and he would invite everyone in just as if he was standing in the Broken Spoke. And it's very sad that we lost James White in 2021. But the legacy that he began in 1964 continues with his family, his widow, Annetta White, his daughters, Terry and Jeannie, and all of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So the Broken Spoke in the slideshow is kind of just a little picture of what my book has in it. And it has 50 pictures, and some of those are mine, and some of those belong to Rick Henson and to a few other people. But I think that you'll enjoy this little trip through memory lane. So we can start with the next slide.
All right.
And there's a picture of James and Annetta in front of the Broken Spoke. I'm really proud of that. That was taken when they first began thinking about getting a book and getting a movie started about the Broken Spoke, but was used in my book in 2013. Okay, go ahead.
All
Next.
right.
And that's how the Broken Spoke looked in 1964. It was a one-room wood building that was formerly a lumber yard along South Lamar Boulevard. And then it was exactly a mile outside the city limits. And the city, of course, grew up around it. Okay, next slide. The very longest running act was the Giesensaw Brothers from 1964 to 2005. And they were a comedy duo, and they kind of took hit songs from plays and movies and Broadway, and they changed the lyrics quite a bit. And people got to know them really well. Of course, a lot of people got to know them through the radio shows too at Coke FM. Next slide. And the Broken Spoke was made truly more famous in 1966 when the legendary band leader Bob Wills graced the stage at the Broken Spoke. And he had been in some ill health, and his band had been kind of in different places throughout Texas. When he stepped into the Broken Spoke and went up on stage and played his fiddle and performed his music with David Duncan and some of the other Texas playboys. He also came back in 1967 and 69. And the next slide shows that the very first band to play at the Broken Spoke in 1965 was the Dave Perry band. And Mr. White gave away beer and barbecue, and the band played, and that's kind of how they got started. That's how people began to know. And of course, the legendary Bob Wills was going to play there in just a year later. These are kind of out of sync. Sorry, go to the next one, please. And Willie Nelson began performing solo there at the Broken Spoke in 1968. That's him with a turtleneck and short hair standing next to James White. And he would play sometimes with his band, the Record Men, and they would perform his song, The Record Man. And Mr. White used to just love to have him perform on stage. And he would only pay him at that time, I think it was the band and him was like around $400 or $500. And as the years went on, Mr. White couldn't afford for Willie Nelson and his band to play there, of course. And so Willie would drop in occasionally and he would perform for free just as a guest.
Wow.
Okay, next slide. And here he is with his famous Jimmy Day and Paul English at the drums and the steel guitar in 1969. Okay, next slide. And then Willie Nelson continued to perform at the Broken Spoke pretty much off and on up until into the 1990s, and he even performed a private party there in the 2010s. Next slide. And Hank Thompson performed at the Broken Spoke in 1965. A lot of people really probably don't remember some of his music, but he was famous at the time, and that helped get Mr. White on the tour through the United States. A lot of bands said, well, if Hank Thompson plays there, then we want to play there too. Next slide. And of course, Kitty Wells, the queen of country music, performed at the Broken Spoke in the 1970s. And it was just a wonderful performance, and so many people remember that night. This photo was taken by Rick Henson. Next photo, next slide. And Patsy Montana performed at the Broken Spoke too in the 1970s. Next slide. And George Strait performed at the Broken Spoke from 1975 through the 1980s. And it's a funny story in my book how he began playing at the Broken Spoke. He had gotten out of the Army and he had formed a band, and he was playing a little bit in San Marcos at Cheatham Warehouse, but he got a call from Alvin Crow, who was performing with the Pleasant Valley Boys regularly at the Broken Spoke and still does. But he got a call, and Alvin was a little bit stretched too thin. He was playing a wedding and he couldn't get to the Broken Spoke. And he called his friend George Strait and the Ace in the Hole band, and he said, could you fill in for me until I get there? So that's how George Strait started playing at the Broken Spoke. And Mr. White paid him just a few $100s to start. And as the years went on, the price of George Strait and the Ace in the Hole band went up and up and up. And then his Unwound hit came out. George Strait became famous somewhat overnight. And Mr. White could no longer afford to book George Strait and the Ace in the Hole band in the 1980s. But George Strait never forgot James White. In fact, his recent album a couple of years ago was Honky-Tonk Time Machine, and he put a picture of the Broken Spoke on the cover, and he performed for a video that went with that song inside the Broken Spoke. So it's quite an honor, I think. Next slide. And Marcia Ball began performing at the Broken Spoke in 1973 at the very first campaign fundraiser for then Congressman Lloyd Doggett. And she performed with her Frida and the Fire Dogs band, and the hippies and the cowboys were peacefully dancing on the dance floor. Some of the hippies really didn't know the country western music that Marcia Ball and her band were performing. So they did what Mr. White liked to call a hoedown. They locked arms and they kind of spun around the dance floor. And some of them didn't wear shoes. Some of them wore moccasins. Some wore overalls. Mr. White got a big kick out of that. And he thought, I ought to do something like this more often. And so what he did is he started booking more crossover bands in the Broken Spoke. And several people began to notice this there, and also at the Armadillo and the Soap Creek Saloon and the Cactus Cafe. And Austin became known as the town where progressive country music began. It was quite an honor for Mr. White at the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2018 to be recognized for that. Next slide. So here's a picture of Marcia Ball performing with Gary P. Nunn and Alvin Crowe and Jimmy Day from Willie Nelson's band in 1975. Next slide. And Ray Benson and Asleep at the Wheel began performing at the Broken Spoke in the 1970s too. Ray Benson performed with his Asleep at the Wheel band on stage then, and he has several times over the years returned to play. And he's so tall that there's a place on the stage that he and his band members poked a hole in the ceiling so that Ray Benson could stand on the stage and perform. So you'll notice sometimes that there's a little broken place in that ceiling. Next slide. Here's a wonderful picture with Ernest Tubb, who performed regularly at the Broken Spoke beginning in 1969. And this picture was taken with the late Jerry Jeff Walker and Joe Ely. And they just had a wonderful time. Jerry Jeff Walker always wondered if he would ever get to play with Ernest Tubb. He just loved his music, and he did. Next slide. And here's a picture of the late Jerry Jeff, who performed at the Broken Spoke for the 2014, the 50th anniversary of the Broken Spoke. I took this picture when he performed. And of course, he's passed on. And as the Broken Spoke celebrates their 60th anniversary in November, we'll remember that wonderful performance with Jerry Jeff. Next slide. And here's the Texas Playboys reunion photo that Rick Henson took in 1975. These are just some of the Texas Playboys that performed, but they all came together for this reunion at the Broken Spoke. Next slide. Sons of the Pioneers were very popular in the 1970s, and they performed at the Broken Spoke often as well. Next slide. And the great late Johnny Bush performed often at the Broken Spoke throughout the 1970s, and Mr. White honored him in several different award ceremonies over the years before he passed away, because Johnny Bush was a regular at the Broken Spoke and very fondly loved and followed by the Broken Spoke fans. Next slide. And here's Leon Rush performing with the Texas Playboys. With Alvin Crowe. Leon Rush was a very famous Texas Playboy who went on to play in several albums and also in his own albums. And Alvin Crowe was honored with him sitting in and performing with him in 75. Next slide. We always had people dropping by the Broken Spoke. You may have seen recently that Dua Lipa even stopped by the Broken Spoke. Well, Dwight Yoakam performed with the Giesenslaws at the Broken Spoke in the 1980s. He just popped in, and that's the Giesenslaws $2 or $3 light show, they used to call it, the Christmas lights strung from the ceiling at the Broken Spoke. Next slide. And the late, great Freddie Fender performed at the Broken Spoke in the 1980s too. Next slide. Johnny Rodriguez and Friends performed at the Broken Spoke regularly in the 1980s, and Mr. White loved Johnny Rodriguez, and he would perform solo when he wasn't with his friends, but he started at the Broken Spoke. Next slide. Mr. White always loved Ray Price and was so proud when Ray Price came to perform on stage at the Broken Spoke in 1990. Next slide. And the late Kinky Friedman performed with Joe Ely and Billy Joe Shaver and Mary Hattersley in 2006. And I believe that this was the night that Kinky announced that he was running for governor. I'm not quite sure if it was, but it was close. And they all got together and performed. And on the right, you see Mary Hattersley, Sweet Mary, they called her, playing the fiddle. Next slide. Here's Rusty Weir with Jerry Jeff Walker, just sort of hanging out at the Broken Spoke in 1983. Next slide. And we just lost recently Chris Christopherson. This was a great performance with Willie Nelson and then James White. And in the background there, you see Joe Ely. This was Christmas in 1990, after Mr. White had heard that the IRS was trying to collect $16.5 million from Willie in unpaid taxes because his bookkeeper had embezzled quite a sum. And so Mr. White put a 5-pound pickle jar on the counter in the bar, and he collected money, and he collected quite a big sum, not a million, but 10,000, and he sent it to Willie by way of Lana Nelson, Willie's daughter. And when Willie got the package, and he was in Hawaii for Christmas, and he said, I'm going to come home to Austin, and I'm going to bring a friend of mine, and we're going to play at the Broken Spoke. And I just thank you from the bottom of my heart for sending that money to help me and my family, who had left everything behind when the IRS confiscated his ranch. And some of his good friends helped him get it all back, of course. You know the rest of the story. But that was the night that he brought Chris Christopherson to the Broken Spoke. Next slide. And here's another picture with Chris Christopherson and the great famous Doug Sahm in Austin. Everybody remembers Doug Sahm. And he was a protege like Alvin Crowe and played the fiddle and other instruments. And so the two became very good pals, and they got to hang out and play with Willie and Chris in 1990. The sons of Johnny Cash began playing at the Broken Spoke in 2000 after they gained permission from the family to call themselves the Sons of Johnny Cash. This is James White with Joey Lee and Gary P. Nunn and Jimmy Dale Gilmore of the Flatlanders, and the late Chris Wall, who helped host the Broken Spoke series. This was a marvelous thing that happened. Pebbles Wadsworth, who was the director of the Fine Arts Department at UT, decided to bring the Broken Spoke series to the symphony set in Austin. So what she did is she had Mr. White be the MC, and he booked these bands that came and performed on the stage once a month over a series of a couple of years. And it was great. They would bring in the hay bales, and they would bring in the wagon wheel, the giant wagon wheel that they always roll at the Broken Spoke. And all of his friends, including Willie Nelson, would perform at the symphony series. They even had Mr. White's Coupe de Ville out front parked, and somebody cooking barbecue when they had those nights at the Broken Spoke at the symphony. Next slide. And Dolly Parton performed and filmed her Wild Texas Wind movie at the Broken Spoke in 1991. A lot of people don't know this, but Dolly wrote it and she starred in it, and she wanted to call it Big T, but it was a made-for-TV movie. And NBC directors said, we are not going to have Dolly Parton in a movie that is called Big T on TV. So what they did was they decided to call it Wild Texas Wind. It had Gary Busey starring as kind of the mean boyfriend, and Mr. White got to play himself, the bar owner. And she came out on stage and she sang, and everyone started chanting, Big T, Big T. But anyway, if you can still watch that movie, Wild Texas Wind, it's on YouTube. Next slide. Alvin Crowe performed with the Texas Playboys' Johnny Gimbel at the Broken Spoke in 1993. Next slide. And Junior Brown and Jerry Jeff Walker and Leroy Carnell performed together with Alvin Crowe at the Broken Spoke in 1993. And a lot of people remember Junior Brown as kind of a different kind of performer who had so much promise and so much talent. And I think that the old timers remember him most of all. Next slide. Joe Ely, Marty Stewart, of course, and Travis Tritt, along with Jimmy Dale Gilmore, performed together at the Broken Spoke in 1990. Next slide. And this is blues piano player Joe Willie Pinetop Perkins. He was a very famous local performer, a blues performer, not a country performer. But he came to the Broken Spoke often, and it just so happened the night that John and Kathy Coons decided to get married, because they had lived together for a long time, but they decided to get married, and Joey Lee played on stage, and Pine Top sold CDs from the side of the stage, and Kathy Coons, they own Waterloo Records, went up and told Joe Ely that they were going to get married, and he needed to stop playing. So he did. And they brought the minister up, and Joe Ely performed. And Joe Ely left the stage, and the Coonses got married. And the whole time, Pinetop Perkins continued to sell his CDs from the side of the stage. And so at the moment that the minister pronounced John and Kathy husband and wife, Pinetop yelled, "Sold!" from the corner of the stage. But anyways, so the late Pinetop Perkins even graced the Broken Spoke stage, even though he wasn't a country singer. Next slide. And the late James Slim Hand began performing at the Broken Spoke in 2006 when he sat in with the band. I think it was Alvin Crow, if my memory serves me. But he had never performed before in front of an audience, and he became an instant success and went on to produce albums and to be just a wonderful classic singer that just beloved by everyone in Texas. Next slide. And here's Brooks and Dunn as they performed at the Broken Spoke in 1990. And in their show in Las Vegas, they even had a fake Broken Spoke stage and facade set up in Las Vegas on the stage when they performed. That's how much they loved the Broken Spoke. Next slide. Pauline Reese began playing at the Broken Spoke when she was just 16 years old. And
Wow.
Jack Ingram, I think, was like maybe 19 or 20. They got their start at the Broken Spoke, and she became famous in the Guinness Book of World Records too for riding her horse onto the stage at the Broken Spoke. But yeah, she became quite famous and is still famous and performs all over Texas. Next slide. And Dale Watson began performing at the Broken Spoke in the 1990s, and he still performs at least once a month there and sometimes at the Continental Club. He's beloved in Austin, even though he lives in Nashville now most of the time. But he's always on the road, always performing, and he's just a delightful person to interview. I asked him what his favorite memory of the Broken Spoke was. And, the Broken Spoke has so many people that have been married at the Broken Spoke or had their wedding reception at the Broken Spoke. So he became an official minister and began performing weddings at the Broken Spoke from the stage. And this one couple who still go to the Broken Spoke and dance came up on stage, and he pronounced the man and wife. And he told them to go out to his bus and sign the paperwork, and he'd be out in a minute. And lo and behold, after they left to go backstage or in the parking lot behind the Broken Spoke in his bus, he told the audience that they were consummating their marriage, which wasn't true, of course. But when they came back in, the crowd just went nuts. And the man and wife didn't know why they were being cheered so loudly. But anyways, it's in the book. Next slide. And Jason Roberts played at the Broken Spoke with Asleep at the Wheel until the 2000s. And now he's a solo performer in his own right who plays at the Broken Spoke with his band. Next slide. Oh, that's a repeat of a previous slide. Go to the next one. Bruce Robeson began performing at the Broken Spoke in the 1990s after he and his brother had a band in Bandera, where they're from. And Bruce was washing dishes during the day and writing songs. And he became famous with the song by the Dixie Chicks. They used to be called, now they're just called the Chicks. But he became famous for that song that they sang about the little girl who's in love with the soldier who doesn't come home. So he has quite a following and performs still occasionally at the Broken Spoke. Next slide. The Derailers began performing at the Broken Spoke in 2000s, and they still are pretty much a regular residence at the Broken Spoke. You have to check the calendar once a month to see when they're performing, but it's usually on a Thursday. And they just have so many beloved followers. Next slide. And there's Jack Ingram again. And he's so famous now, of course. Everyone knows who Jack Ingram is. And he's been in and out of Austin quite often with charity work and fundraising, you know, with so many different people, celebrities in Austin over the years. Next slide. Scott Byron performed at the Broken Spoke's 50th anniversary party, and I took this picture. Next slide. And Patricia Vaughn and Rosie Flores also performed together on stage at the 50th anniversary. And Rosie still performs regularly around Austin and around the United States. And of course, Patricia Vaughn just came back from a European tour. Next slide. Lucky Tub and Jesse Dayton performed at the Broken Spoke in 2014 at the 50th anniversary. And I just found out that Jesse Dayton is coming back to perform at the 60th anniversary at the Broken Spoke. It'll be one of those nights the week of November 12th. So the party for the Broken Spoke 60th is actually going to be a day early on November 9th because their anniversary is the 10th of November. And then every night that week that follows, it's going to be a different performance with lots of stars sitting in, dropping in to celebrate the Broken Spoke. Next slide. Weldon Henson, he always performs on Tuesdays for Two-Step Tuesdays at the Broken Spoke. He is in residence and he got his start there at the Broken Spoke after he got out of the military. And everyone just loved him. He's just wonderful, him and his family. Next slide. And Kevin Fowler, who began performing at the Broken Spoke in 1991, has become so famous. He hasn't really come to perform again at the Broken Spoke, but he'll sit in occasionally. And this was in 2014 when he came by for the 50th anniversary of the Broken Spoke. Go ahead, next slide. And of course, Alvin Crow with James White. He is now the longest running act at the Broken Spoke. He started in 1974 and he still performs at the Broken Spoke regularly. Next slide. Two Tons of Steel began performing at the Broken Spoke in 2000. Next slide. Shelley King performed at the Broken Spoke in 2014 for the 50th anniversary. And she's sort of a crossover blues and country folk kind of singer. Hasn't come back to play at the Broken Spoke since, but she plays all over the United States and Europe. Next slide. Monty Warden is a very beloved member of the White family, a cousin to Ginny White, and he plays at the Broken Spoke regularly still with the Wagoneers that he helped form. And he wrote a lot of George Strait's songs. He became famous for writing songs, but he sings really well too. Next slide. And here's Willie Nelson and Ray Benson performed together for a private party in 2016 on stage at the Broken Spoke. And I took that picture. Next slide. Garth Brooks performed at the Broken Spoke on St. Patrick's Day in 2017 during South by Southwest. He posted a broken wagon wheel on Twitter, which is now called X. And he said, I'm going to go out and party. Anybody want to join me? And he showed up at the Broken Spoke. And I was right there front and center and filmed it and took this picture. Next slide. Here's an old postcard that Mr. White used to give out to everybody who came to the Broken Spoke from out of town. And it has his old Coupe de Ville and his wagon wheel with the spoke broken out and him standing there in his leather vest. in the old rustic red building that's now surrounded by commercial real estate on South Lamar Boulevard. And it kind of looks like the Stuart Little House because it's squeezed between those two concrete buildings. But we were lucky enough and we tried really hard and we got a historical marker for that building. Yeah, the year before last, and then last year I was successful in getting the city of Austin to recognize them for historic zoning. So hopefully that building will be protected for generations to come. Next slide. James White passed away peacefully at home January 24th, 2001, at the age of 21. He was a native Austinite. He grew up in Oak Hill. All of his uncles and his grandfathers, they were all Texas Rangers. In fact, his great uncle, Tom White, was the star of the Flowers of the Texas, the recent movie that came out about the Native Americans that were wiped out, the Osage Indians in Oklahoma. And his great uncle, Tom White, was one of the Texas Rangers and founders of the FBI. Next slide. And his life took a different path because he wanted to create a bar, a dance hall, a honky-tonk like the kind that he used to visit with his parents when he was a boy in the 1940s. So when he got out of the service, he decided that he was going to come back to Austin and he was going to open his own honky-tonk. And that's what he did. Next slide. And he began dating Annetta White, who was then Annetta Wells, while he was stationed in San Antonio, and they got married in 1966. And ever since, Mrs. White has been working at the Broken Spoke. Even after Mr. White passed, she continued to run the cash register and cook in the kitchen occasionally, and she'll greet you when you come in on the weekends. She very seldom misses a weekend night. Next slide. The Broken Spoke, as I said, received the historical marker in 2022. Then in 2023 was designated historic zone by the city of Austin. And she carries on his legacy. The other photographers that contributed to this slideshow and are mentioned in my book, and their photos are in my book, in addition to Rick Henson, are Don Winker Emmons, Will Van Overbeek, and Kirk Weedle, who took the picture for the cover. And I thank you. So you can buy these books and print in ebook or in audio anywhere the books are sold. Book People, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, and of course, my beloved Texas A&M University Press. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that. Let me close out of this real quick. All right. Now, if you don't mind, if I ask you a couple questions about yourself?
I'd love that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, first of all, open-ended question. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I hate to say that I'm not a native Texan, but like everyone says, I got here as fast as I could. I moved to Texas with my family, and we moved to El Paso in 1969. And I ended up going to Texas, West Texas A&M, which was West Texas State then in Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
And my professor, Charles Townsend, the history professor and English teacher, he used to play Bob Wills music in his classroom at West Texas State. And I fell in love with Bob Wills music and Tex Ritter and all of the stars, Gene Autry. And Professor Townsend would wear a little kerchief on his neck and a cowboy hat. And I just thought, this is so great. And so I began dancing in dance halls and country music in the Amarillo area until I graduated. But I never forgot the roots of Texas music and the classic styles of dancing. And so wherever I lived, when I moved back to El Paso and then on to Austin, I had to find country music. And I began dancing at the Broken Spoke in 1982 and fell in love with all the bands that played there. Some of them still do, like Alvin Crow.
Mhm.
And my husband and I just loved going to the Broken Spoke, and we loved it. And so I when we went there one time and met Mr. White,
Mhm.
and I thought, this is an interesting place that should go down in history. And then I had been a reporter for 9 years, mostly
Uh-huh.
police beat. And then I decided to be a teacher. And I was a teacher for 24 years and had my son,
Mhm.
continued to dance at the Broken Spoke. And that's when I met one of my students was the granddaughter of James White. She
Oh,
was in my
wow.
broadcast class. And she said, you know, I was making an assignment for the kids to make a documentary, a mini documentary about a family member. And she said, I want to make a documentary about my grandpa. And I said, well, who's that? And she said, James White. And I went, oh my gosh. So we went to the Broken Spoke and I helped her record. And then afterwards, Mr. White came up to me and he said, I've always wanted a book about this place. And I said, I can do that for you. I'm going to retire in about 2 weeks. So that's how I started.
It's wonderful. And having that insider track, and it's interesting how that particular situation just fell into your lap like kismet.
It was Kismet for sure.
And then actually there's a similar story about how you started your second book, um, The Secessionist Standoff.
Yep.
Um, do you want to go into that a little bit? Because I thought that was so amazing when I read that.
Peyton McKnight was a beloved senator who used to put a little chuck wagon out in front of the Broken Spoke and cook chili, and he would wear a war bonnet. He was quite colorful. And he's in my book.
Uh-huh.
And so when I had a book signing at the Broken Spoke, his daughter, Molly McKnight, came up to me with a packet of newspaper clippings. And she said, I know what your next book's going to be. And of course, I had heard about the secessionist standoff because I drove through that area of Fort Davis many, many times over the years, driving from Austin to El Paso to visit my extended family.
Mhm.
So, yes, I jumped at the chance and began interviewing her friend, Joanne Turner,
Mhm.
who was the secretary for the Republic of Texas Militia.
Mhm.
And then it grew into this giant mushroom of a story. And I interviewed all the judges, all the prosecutors, all the Texas Rangers, residents, you name it. And then the FBI agent who served as the consultant at the standoff, he was also the consultant at Waco.
Wow.
And he wrote my books forward. Yep.
That's right, he did. You're right. Oh, goodness.
Yep.
And so it sounds like, and I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask was to tell us a little bit about how you research, your when you write these books. Um, but you were a reporter, so certainly you have that part of that anyway in your skill set as a reporter. But were there other things? Tell us a little bit about that process.
Yes, well, I like to say that I farm people's stories.
Oh,
That's pretty
nice.
much what I do. There's always a story. Somebody on a plane or in a grocery store line or church, you name it. There's always somebody that has a story, right?
Mm.
And it's just up to me to discern which stories are big enough that I can farm them and turn them into an article or a book. I've been a freelancer for 15 years too, but what I did is I just start with one person and they become the primary source. And then that leads to me searching on ancestry.com and in the white pages for other primary sources. I don't like to use secondary or third party sources. I like to use primary sources. So
Sure.
I will go to the person or I will call them and I will ask them if they will allow me to interview them, and I record it. Then I transcribe it. Then I send the transcribed document to them.
Hmm.
make sure that I got it correct. And then they send it back to me with anything that they think they want to delete or change or whatever. And then I either summarize it, the parts that are facts, I summarize them, and I pull the most dramatic quotes that have strong opinions and lots of color and put
Mhm.
that in the book.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is really, because I've always wondered that. That's a wonderful, thank you for explaining that process.
Yeah.
So, um, so a little bit frivolous, but what was the best band or some of the best bands you've seen at the Broken Spoke?
Well, certainly, I mean, the Garth Brooks performance was probably the most famous because he just for free stood on stage for 45 minutes and sang all his hits.
Mhm.
And anybody who was present at the time, I think we broke the fire code that night. There's only supposed to be 610 people in the building, but there were more. But we were all squished up to the stage. Nobody was dancing, nobody was moving. Everyone was singing along. So that was probably the most famous. Um, but and of course Willie Nelson with Ray Benson
Mhm.
performing at the Girling private birthday party was tremendous. When I tweeted that on Twitter, a bunch of people were bemoaning the fact that they didn't know that he was playing there and that they wished that they had gone by. But of course, it was a private party on a Monday. That's usually when the private parties are. But Willie Nelson sang all of his famous songs that people just loved, and Ray Benson too. It was wonderful.
No, that is that, and it was great to be able to experience that too,
Yeah.
especially for a place that means so much to you. And so, and tell me if I'm wrong, I might have misunderstood, but you were the documentary, Honky-Tonk Heaven, Legend of the Broken Spoke. Did that come from your student, Mr. White's granddaughter's project, or was that something completely separate?
That was separate, actually. She only did a 5-minute documentary for my class,
Hmm.
but Brenda Mitchell, who was a big fan of the Broken Spoke too, I had never met her before, but I'm sure that many, many times we were in the Broken Spoke at the same time dancing. Her and her husband frequented the Broken Spoke at the same time over the years that I did with my husband. And she celebrated a birthday there, and she told James White, "You need to have a movie about this place."
Oh, wow.
She didn't have any experience with doing documentaries or any of that, but she just got the equipment, hired a crew, and went after it. And while we were working at the same time, I was working on the book, she was working on the movie. And so occasionally we were both interviewing the same person at the Broken Spoke. And sometimes she would ask me to do the interviewing. I wasn't on camera,
Mhm.
but I'm in the credits. I got to interview some of the people that are interviewed in the movie.
Oh, that's really neat.
Yeah, it was fun.
So is the process, because I know that there's been talks about your most recent book being made into a movie. Is that process this time around completely different, or is it similar? How did it even get started?
Well, this is not going to be a documentary.
Ah,
Um, we're
fair.
writing we're writing a biopic of a true crime story based on my book. It's an adaptation. My book is not, I wouldn't say a documentary, it's a biography of sorts, woven through as a thread through a true crime story. So Joanne Turner's life in Austin, growing up, marrying and losing everything to foreclosure and joining a militia is the thread that goes through the book, because when she was arrested for writing fraudulent liens against several businesses in Austin for the Republic of Texas militia, Richard Lance McLaren, who is the leader, he decided to start this war. It was in the Fort Davis Mountains, of course,
Hmm.
far away from Austin. But that process of writing that book is much different than writing a movie. And I have written a couple of other screenplays, but they've not been optioned. So I sought out a very well known producer of features and documentaries who lives in Phoenix, and her name is Cynthia Urich. And we connected, and she has been collaborating with me. We've written the pilot, and we're writing the other episodes. There's probably going to be 4. And it is a biopic. And if you've been on Amazon and seen the Waco biopic, this is going to be similar to that.
Gotcha.
It's a reenactment of sorts, and based on the book that I wrote about Texas secessionists in 1997 who had a standoff with the Texas Rangers in the Davis Mountains for 7 days.
Mhm.
They were
Wow.
trying to take Texas back. And
Yeah.
it's different process than writing a book, much different,
And
even
how
though I'm
so?
using the book.
In what particular ways, if you don't mind my asking?
Well, when you write a book, okay, you have so much literary license to narrate, if you will, story, and to pick and choose dialogue, and to lots of description, right?
Hmm.
You want to have lots of creative description. So, but when you write a screenplay, it's very compressed. You have to choose the very best words that someone speaks, and you have very little description. You are, if you're getting any description in there, it's only of the immediate scene, and you have to break an entire story of nearly 400 pages in a book adaptation into in this case, it's a 60-page double-spaced screenplay.
Wow.
And so it's very compressed. And, in the book, you get to have lots of freedom to write details. Whereas in a screenplay, they don't want the details. They want, if you do have details, they have to be very specific.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much for explaining that.
Yeah. And the way I got the experience to write screenplays was I was a first round reader judge for the Austin Film Festival for 10 years while I was teaching. So I used to bring my students to the Austin Film Festival every year. And I worked all summer reading screenplays that other people submitted for the festival.
Well,
So,
yeah, that makes sense because then you would see what works, what doesn't work.
yeah,
Doing research even though you weren't actually researching. That's really kind of cool.
that's right. Well, everything in life, all of life's experiences contribute when you're a writer. You're always absorbing and taking notes and paying attention to things that other people probably don't. That's your job or your curiosity.
Sure, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you for explaining that. I think um, usually we would open it up for questions, but we're pretty close to the end of things. So how about as a last question, I ask you what it is that you're working. Do you have a new project? What are you doing now since besides the screenplay?
Well, I actually started on this project before this Texas secessionist standoff book. I visited Praha, Texas, which was settled at the turn of the century by Czechoslovakians.
Uh-huh.
And it was a very small community of 100 people. And they lost more of their own boys in World War II towards the final stages of the war than any other city per capita in the United States. They lost 9. And these were very young men, all single. And there's 3 little shrines outside St. Mary's Church there in Praha, Texas. And their pictures are in the shrines, their names, the days they were born, and the day that they died, and where they died. And that was it. And I thought, well, that's just not right.
Mm.
So I began going on ancestry.com and searching for the relatives of these 9 men. And I found quite a few of the families before they passed away. They
Wow.
were in their 80s and 90s. And I got their pictures and I got stories, but I'm still missing 2 of the 9 families, 2 families. And I'm sitting on the fence a little bit about whether to write a historical fiction based on the facts that I've accumulated, or to keep pursuing to find those final 2 families.